Thanks, welcome. Happy Black History Month. It makes it sound like I couldn't hold a job, but those were kind of like moonlighting gigs back when I was really young and baby needed shoes. So, but MCC has been the main focus of my teaching career. Let me tell you a little bit about the plan for today. This is probably not going to go till 1:30. We have, that's the time block that's available to us, but this presentation was designed to be more like about an hour. I'm trying to think of the best way to start this. This grows out of a presentation I did for Black History Month in 2015, where I basically talked about the chronology of Du Bois's career. A lot of people haven't heard of him, which is a crime. Who was he? Why is he important? What does his work mean to us today, and so forth. But then a couple years ago, I went to the American Sociological Association annual meeting in Chicago, and there was a presentation by Alden Morris, who is a veteran sociology professor at Northwestern University, and he was talking about his new book, A Scholar Denied, where he basically argued that not only was Du Bois was not an isolated figure who did a little bit of work and then turned in research work and then became an activist. He is a legitimate founding father of not just of sociology in the United States, but of sociology in general. And that the standard narrative, if you take Introduction to Sociology, every introductory sociology book talks about the Marx, Weber, and Durkheim as like the three founding fathers of sociology. No mothers involved. It's a lot of dead white men in that part of the course, and that the first sociology department was at the University of Chicago with Albion Small and all these things, blah, 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 blah. What Morris is arguing is that in fact, Du Bois's research facility at Atlanta University, which is a historically black institution, really started sociology. And there was a lot more significant work done, but it was basically suppressed because it was a black school. And he was a black man, and he got suppressed more than anybody else by one of the founding fathers at the University of Chicago. So his work was derailed in a white supremacist conspiracy. And the argument is very well documented. It's one of those books that, a third of it is footnotes. So the last couple times I've done this presentation, I've added to the chronological part more about Morris's argument in his recent book. So that's the plan of the presentation. And I've renamed it The Scholar Denied. Okay, so who was W.E.B. Du Bois? And it is Du Bois. It's not Du Bois. It's like, where my daughter went down to Marseilles, Illinois, to get a puppy, and you don't say Marseille. Any French place names in the United States are always pronounced differently. So it is Du Bois. William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. And that's Alden Morris. So let's turn to Du Bois. He was born in 1868. He died in 1963. He was 95 years old, and he was active intellectually for all the way up till the end. What a unique lifespan. He was born at kind of the high point, depending on how you look at it, of the Reconstruction era, that there looked like there might be a possibility for multiracial democracy in the world, in America, and he died the night before Dr. King's March on Washington. And they announced his death at that event. So you can't write this stuff, right? It's just almost too coincidental that his life overlapped with so many important events in American and world history, but also black history. He was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. Now, living in the Chicago area, I think this is just another one of the Barringtons, right? You got Barrington, Lake Barrington, South Barrington, North Barrington, Barrington Hills, and Great Barrington. No, it's just named after a place in You know, in England, it was a mill town. And Du Bois talks in his autobiographical work, about the golden Housatonic River that flowed through Great Barrington. Well, it was golden because of all the industrial waste. You know, it was one of those kinds of things where tanneries and shoe factories and so forth. And there still are some of the old mills, paper mills. Those are notorious polluters even to this day. So there was a lot of nasty stuff bubbling in that, in the golden Housatonic. But the fact that it was Massachusetts is also important. My case is going to be that in many ways his origins are unique for a black man born in 1868. For one thing, Massachusetts, more than any other state, I would argue, had an abolitionist community going way back into the early 19th century. White people who actually wanted to abolish slavery and, as a matter of principle, wanted things to be better for African Americans. There weren't very many white people like that in 1868, but you were more likely to run into them in Massachusetts than any place else. And in fact, the principal of the high school that Du Bois attended in Great Barrington, a man named Hosmer, was an ardent abolitionist already, and he was a mentor, rescued Du Bois from being sent to the Boys Industrial School for stealing apples off of old Farmer Brown, and bought him books and encouraged him to apply to college. And again, that's a sequence of events that was pretty unusual for a black man. It would have been inconceivable probably for a black woman who was born in 1868. There also weren't very many black people in Great Barrington. There were some, but there weren't enough black people for there to be a black neighborhood, a ghetto. The housing was not segregated. The downtrodden group that people looked down upon in Great Barrington were the Irish, which is, if you know anything about the history of Irish Americans, that shouldn't come as any great surprise. So the racial climate that Du Bois grew up in Great Barrington was quite different from that of the vast majority of African Americans of his era. He became aware of race. He tells this story, okay? Now he had a tendency to kind of rewrite his history as he got older. Well, you know, he had many opportunities to do so, living to be 95 years old. But in 1903, he wrote that the first time he really noticed that he was black was when he gave a little girl a Valentine's card, and she was new in town. You know, the other kids knew him and they'd gone to school with him for a while, and she, didn't accept his card. That also ties into another theme that Du Bois was a notorious ladies' man. He was a very good provider as a husband and father, but he fooled around a lot. I don't admire that aspect of him. I'm for monogamy and all that stuff. Now that it's on videotape, you know, in case my wife sees this on CNN or something like that. But that's what happened. And all consensual relationships, I don't think he would have been in trouble in the era of Me Too. Women were drawn to him, and you look at the women that he did have affairs with, and they were all smart, and they were all black. So, you know, it's just a really interesting sidebar to his story, but it's interesting that his awareness of his racial difference came in context of going after trying to appeal to a young woman. So as he grew up, it turns out that he didn't have to defer to white people. And for the vast majority of black men born in 1868, you had to do that or you would die. You would be killed or you would be in prison. But he talks in the book that he wrote in 1903 about how as he became aware of racial differences and racial inequality, his attitude was, I'm going to beat them at this. I'm going to beat them in the examination room. I'm going to beat them on the ball field, and I'm going to beat their stringy heads. And again, for a black man to say, I'm going to beat white people's stringy heads is a good way to get yourself killed in most places in the United States at that time. So just from the very start, he was very different. Another issue is that obviously he wasn't born a slave because he was born in 1868, but his parents were not slaves. His parents' parents were not slaves. His family background was free for generations on both sides. One of his Du Bois ancestors was set free after the Revolutionary War by his master for his effort in the war. So again, the slavery experience was not something that he grew up having any direct connection to. He was of mixed race, as most African Americans are. He was aware of his ancestry, and he wasn't ashamed of his white ancestry, but he did not cling to it. He very clearly identified from a very early age as a Negro, as they used to say back in the old days. But he was proud of his French Huguenot ancestors, and he was proud of the Germans and in his background. So I mentioned that he still suffered from racism, not just the calling card incident, but the almost getting sent to reform school for getting involved in some minor schoolboy stuff. So when he got he wanted to go to Harvard. Nobody from Great Barrington went to Harvard, black or white. So but again, with Principal Hosmer encouraging him, he wanted to go, but the high school that he went to wasn't really good enough for him to go directly to Harvard, so he went to Fisk in Nashville, Tennessee, a historically black school, famous probably more than anything else for the Fisk Jubilee Singers, who pioneered the singing of Negro spirituals. Really, this is before the invention of gospel music as we know it today, but singing songs like Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen and those kinds of things. And they used that to raise funds because, like all HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, Fisk was always struggling for money. And this turned out to be a very effective fundraiser. This was when, for the first time in his life, Du Bois was spending time around other black people. And they were mostly from the South. They had different manners from him. He was very reserved and formal in his bearing. They were more backslapping, how's your mama and them kind of thing. And he really, really fell in love with black women. Many years before the Black is Beautiful movement that came out in the 1960s, he championed the beauty of black women. So another theme of this presentation is that Du Bois was far ahead of his time in many, many respects. And I just recently discovered, just out of the clear blue sky, maybe I'm the only one who's ever called attention to this, something else that he was very far ahead of his time. So I'll leave you waiting anxiously to find out what that was. So Fisk, he still needed a summer job. So in the summer, he walked out of Fisk and walked till he found a summer teaching job at a black college, or a black school, elementary school, which gave him further insight into the way most black people lived. Because again, most black people lived in the South, most black people were poor in those days, and that further sharpened his sociological awareness. So he went to Harvard. He graduated from Fisk in 1888. Small school, small graduating class. And he went to Harvard. He got his bachelor's degree in 1890. You can see which one is him. He was an outstanding student, outstanding enough to be featured as a speaker for his bachelor's degree. Then he continued on. Soon after, I got this one a little bit out of order here. This is about 1898. with his wife Nina Gomer was her name, Gomer, and their son Burghardt. Burghardt died at the age of 2 from diphtheria in Atlanta, where I'm getting slightly ahead of the chronology here, and he was never really the same, and Nina was definitely not the same. She basically had some serious mental health issues as a consequence. Burghardt was going to be the savior of the black race, you know, that he had Du Bois as a father, you know, the genes were good, and he was the golden boy, you know, but he passed away. They had a daughter, Yolanda, who was born a few years later. His book, The Souls of Black Folk from 1903, is dedicated to Burghardt and Yolanda, the lost and the found. And he pinned a lot of his hopes on her, and she just wanted to be a normal kid. So that was problematic, and Nina would wash her shoes. She became so germ-phobic because of what had happened to poor Burghardt that she was a little, you know, off her rocker when it came to child rearing after that. He got a job, and we're going to listen to Du Bois in audio toward the end of this presentation. After he got out of Harvard, he went to Germany. And that's what everybody did back in those days in the social sciences, to study history or economics or sociology. You weren't nothing if you hadn't gone to Germany. And he had he was always had what we call the sociological imagination, that when things would happen to him in his regular life, he would see the broader significance and how things are connected to other things. And he said that in Germany, he was a person, just instead of a particular kind of person, for the first time in his life. And he liked German girls. This is an enduring theme in his story. He discovered beer, because he'd grown up in a teetotaling home. His mother was, you know, don't you dare go anywhere near a saloon. And he would go riding his bicycle out in the countryside, and then he came back to America and had trouble finding a job. He was hired to do a study for the University of Pennsylvania and called the Philadelphia Negro. Arguably, this was the first legitimate sociological study. I'm getting, well, let's see. Yeah, sorry. Okay, he worked at Wilberforce College, which is a historically black college. He had trouble because he was a free thinker, and this was a very churchy school. And you're going to hear him say he wore gloves and carried a cane and had a carefully tended Van Dyke mustache, all of which he learned to affect when he was in Germany, because he wanted to be, you know, Herr Doktor Professor. That was the idol, the goal of German academics, and a lot of American ones too. And at Wilberforce, one of the first times he came to chapel, all, you know, dandified up like that. And now Professor Du Bois is going to lead us in prayer. And he says, I certainly am not. Or I certainly am not. And so eventually, you know, they wouldn't let him teach sociology. He was teaching Greek and Latin at Wilberforce. It was a gig. You know, he needed money. I think he said he got paid $2,000 a year, which is like $45,000 today. So, you know, it was decent money. But he was hired as a sometime assistant in sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, because they didn't really know what to do with him. He had a PhD from Harvard. He'd been in Germany. He couldn't be on the faculty, but he couldn't be a student because he had the PhD. So they cooked up this role for him, and he directed the research, and the book was published in 1899. By that time, he had found a steady job at Atlanta University, also a historically black college, and inaugurated what are called the Atlanta Studies, which has been referred to as the first school of scientific sociology. And that's what we're going to get back to in a little while when we talk about Holden Morris's book. Let's go back to the Souls of Black Folk. If you've heard of Du Bois at all, this is probably how you've heard about him. It's a book that he wrote in 1903, so think about this. Okay, he was 32, 35 years old. He was going to live for another 60 years after that. So it's a very early snapshot of his thinking. What he was trying to do, he addresses the reader in a preface. He's basically writing to white people. Here's where black people are at. Here's what we're thinking about. Here's how we live. Here are some of the problems that we have. Here are some of the disagreements we have within the black community. And each chapter uses a different method. He's got personal reminiscences. He's got what we would today call micro-sociology, where he studies people face to face and explores social structure as it manifests itself at the face-to-face level. He has studies that we would today call at the micro-macro link, where he starts at the face-to-face level and connects to larger patterns using statistics and so forth. There's a short story. There's a polemic, it would be the word that I would use, arguing about the differences between himself and his great nemesis, Booker T. Washington. And for many of Du Bois's early years, because Washington died in 1915, Washington was from the South. Washington was an ex-slave. He founded the Tuskegee Institute. He was adamant that black folks should not seek higher education, that they should wait about things like voting and using the same water fountain and so forth, that they had to prove themselves in the hustle and bustle of economic life, and then maybe we'll get around to political independence. Du Bois, to put it mildly, found that to be wrong in many, many levels, and takes Washington to task in the book. And the thing that really shocked me when I first read his book back in 2002, up at the cabin in the North Woods of Wisconsin, is the last essay, which is a musicological essay about the Negro spirituals, the African roots of black music, and the powerful, serious content. And as somebody who's been obsessed with jazz and other forms of African American music for practically my whole life, he was way ahead of his time doing that too. 1903, the European composers who were people like Darius Milhaud and so forth, who were adapting, this is way before Gershwin, adapting those kinds of African American forms to European music. He was way before all of those people. He didn't follow up on that. He was not a musicologist, but it is an amazing book. And I assigned it in my race and ethnicity class for many years. But the thing that I would hammer away at, and I'm doing this here today, is that he had a lot more fish to fry after 1903. He went to work for the NAACP. He was one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and for many years he was the editor of their journal, The Crisis. Now, this was based in New York. They got out of Atlanta. Nina didn't like Atlanta. She didn't like having to, Du Bois could stay on campus and get treated like a human being. She had to go to the grocery store and wait for the white ladies to get served. And she, with her background, being Northern and free and so forth, that was bad. And then the death of Burghardt was just the last straw. So, plus, as Du Bois' reputation as a progressive spread, there was a lot of pressure from the white donors who kept Atlanta University afloat, the white Northerners, to get rid of this hot-headed dude. And so he went to New York. Early on in his career, he wrote an essay about Reconstruction. This is a terribly uncovered subject, I think, in American history courses, though not at MCC. The period of I'll try to give the very short version of my presentation. Started at the end of the Civil War, arguably. Could have started with the Emancipation Proclamation, which was before the end of the Civil War. Often dated to 1876 at the other end in the famous Hayes-Tilden Compromise, that in order to letting Rutherford Hayes be president, he would agree to take the federal troops out of the South, leaving the freed people to the tender mercies of their former oppressors. So arguably, though, the Reconstruction wasn't really extinguished until 1896, when in the Plessy versus Ferguson case, the Supreme Court, in not one of its better moments, decided that separate but equal was constitutional. So anyway, in the academic world, including at Harvard and at Columbia, the official interpretation of Reconstruction was that it was a terrible mistake, that a bunch of northern outside agitators came, and damn Yankee carpetbaggers came down and put a bunch of unqualified, chicken-eating, nappy-headed black people who weren't qualified to run things into power, and they screwed everything up, and thank God that the people who really ought to be running the South took it back over again. That was the official line at the most prestigious colleges and universities in America. And Du Bois, in 1916, I think, shredded the whole argument. But it took him until 1935, again, because he didn't really have the institutional backing. He got older. He was about my age when he wrote this book. And he finally wrote a book. It was a challenge because he couldn't go to some of the libraries where the original sources were. Or if he did, he couldn't eat lunch there. He'd have to go take his lunch or he'd have to go someplace else to go to the bathroom, because a lot of the original sources were in libraries in the South. It's a big, fat, heavy book about Black Reconstruction in America. It was originally going to be titled The Black Reconstruction of Democracy in America, but he decided, or the publisher decided, that was too inflammatory. And he basically argued that Reconstruction was successful in some ways, establishing public schools, not just for black people, but for white people too. The old Southern elite wanted to keep the masses ignorant, white and black. But that it was mainly scuttled by terrorist violence. Also, he argued that the decision by Abraham Lincoln to allow black troops helped solve a critical manpower crisis that the Union forces had in the middle of the Civil War. Well, basically, this is the argument that is now the accepted wisdom among historians. Eric Foner's very important book from the late 70s, the Foner book, he basically says, yeah, Du Bois was right. And he was wrong about some things because he didn't have access to all of the sources that he needed, but it was an extremely important book, almost vanished without a trace at the time that the book was written. And he was starting to get kind of pissed off at white people by 1935. He started to turn his attention to Africa. He had written an essay many years before called The African Roots of the War, about how the effort by the colonial powers of Europe in World War I to grab, before World War I, to grab territory in the last place to have colonies, was one of the things that touched off the Great War. That's what they called it before we had an even greater one a few years later. So he'd always been interested in Africa, became very much interested in what's the term, the Pan-African movement, to break down barriers and boundaries within African countries and to shake off the yoke of colonialism. So that began to get him, he turned increasingly in a Marxist direction. By the 1950s, he was being persecuted by the FBI and the CIA. He was arrested and charged with being a foreign agent for being part of establishing the Peace Information Council. He was acquitted in 1951, but his passport was suspended for 8 years after that. He ran for the Senate in 1950 as the Labor Party, U.S. Labor Party. He got 200,000 votes. Nina died that same year. He married Shirley Graham after that. As time went on, I said, going increasingly in a communist direction, he hobnobbed with Chairman Mao. I don't approve of his communist turn later in his life, but I sure understand it when you look at his life history. And finally, he basically said, screw it, I'm out of here. He renounced his American citizenship, joined the Communist Party, and moved to Ghana, where their leader, Kwame Nkrumah, gave him a place, and he was working on some more of his African studies. His goal was to someday have a study of all of black history, Africa and in the African diaspora, the places where black people were dispersed through slavery. Notice he's got kente cloth on his academic robe there. So he was ahead of his time there too. In 1963, y'all. I mean, that's. He also, if you look in the picture, he suffered from vitiligo. That what Michael Jackson had. It's that where people of color have sometimes very large patches of white skin, and I was unaware of that until I looked at some of the pictures of the fellow. So, summarizing his accomplishments, and then we can go on to the scholar denied argument. He was the first African-American Harvard PhD. He was the lead investigator in the Philadelphia Negro. He wrote a very important book in The Souls of Black Folk. He had a role in the founding of the NAACP. It edited The Crisis. He was also even though he was kind of an old-fashioned Victorian father and husband, he was very far ahead of his time with regard to women's rights as well. He wrote an essay in 1920 called The Damnation of Women, where he said, we're wasting human potential because the way things are set up, a woman cannot reach her full potential as a worker and as a mother at the same time. 1920, 100 years ago, he made that argument. And he called for, among other things, motherhood at her own discretion. So he was calling for unconditional reproductive freedom in 1920, when very few people, male or female, black or white, were really calling for that. And then he goes on and talks about how beautiful black women are and how important their contributions have been to the race and to the world. He was important, I said, Pan-Africanism. One thing that I learned when I read the biography, I've read a lot of I'm not an expert on Du Bois, but I have read a lot of his work, and I've read the big fat 2-volume biography of the man, that he was involved. Historically black colleges and universities were established by white people and mostly run by white people for a long time. And in the 1920s and 30s, Du Bois had a role, sometimes behind the scenes, in the effort to wrest control of HBCUs from blacks to whites. From whites to blacks, to blacks from whites. Okay, let's get that right. And that something that isn't usually listed as one of his main accomplishments, but it's a significant one. Black Reconstruction in America changed the whole scholarship, and it closes with some very angry words about those white historians who said this was all a terrible mistake. Just furious words. And the fact that he was one of the first to bring Marxist concepts into the analysis of race. Okay. Now let's talk about, this is an example of some of the careful work that was done in the Philadelphia Negro. A lot of data. And it was at the same time that, Durkheim was doing the same thing in France. But every introductory sociology student reads about Durkheim's book, Suicide, which is a fine book. I had to read it in graduate school. But arguably, Philadelphia Negro is just as good. That's a duplicate. In Germany, this is something now that we're getting into Morris's argument now. He met Max Weber. They were both students at the same time, and Weber is a very famous German sociologist who died in 1920. He was older than Du Bois, but he also didn't live nearly as long, obviously. Morris makes a pretty good case that when Weber started out, he was a biological determinist, meaning that he felt that differences in social outcomes among different groups were fundamentally based on genetics, which is an extremely common view in those days. And that the work done by Du Bois and also by the great anthropologist Franz Boas turned him into a materialist, a cultural determinist, that the things that make groups differ are things like power and culture and politics and so forth, and it's not in our genes. Say a couple of words about Booker T. Washington. I mentioned before that he was a former slave. He gave a speech before a mostly white audience in Atlanta in 1896, the year of Plessy versus Ferguson, where he says, blacks and whites can be as separate as the fingers in our day-to-day interaction, but we can come together like a fist to build the economy. He also made an interesting point. We talked about this in the race and ethnicity class. He said to white Southerners, don't hire immigrants, hire black folk. We know you. We're flesh of your flesh. And we're available. Cast down your bucket where you are. He said that was kind of the meme of in his speech. But what Du Bois says, okay, how did that work out for you? Because now he's writing in 1903, and lynchings are up. The last tiny little vestiges of Reconstruction are being eradicated. There are massacres happening in places like Wilmington, North Carolina. There was a coup in 1898, armed coup of a mixed race ticket that got elected in the city government, and the president didn't send the National Guard, and then 4,000 black people left. Wilmington became a majority white city, and nobody outside in power raised a finger. And Du Bois is arguing this kind of stuff is what happens when black people give up trying to get political power. You have to have political power to keep stuff like this from happening to your people. So they did not see eye to eye. White folks loved Booker T. Washington because he told them I think he really believed it, but he told them what they wanted to hear, so he got all the money. And that was one of the reasons why Du Bois's research, according to Morris, Du Bois's research in Atlanta was just chronically underfunded. He just didn't have the resources because it was all sometimes being consciously diverted from schools like Atlanta that actually wanted to be a real university to places like Tuskegee, which was important, giving mechanical training and so forth. And the villain in all this is the one that the co-author of was the only sociology textbook for decades back in the early 20th century, Robert Park. Robert Park was in the employ of Booker T. Washington as his press agent. that he wrote press releases for Washington. You know, he worked. That was his side gig. You know, you can do that when you're a college professor, especially at Chicago. You don't have to work too hard. Well, you don't have to spend a lot of time in class. Let's put it that way. You have to work hard, but you don't spend a lot of time in class. So you hear them talking about their, well, don't get me started, but their teaching loads are pretty light. And he consciously worked behind the scenes basically to screw Du Bois because he was not following the line of Washington. And, well, so what? You know, was it just that was Du Bois the only victim of this conspiracy? Well, again, when World War II came along, many Americans of goodwill and progressive mindset said, you know, we're fighting a blatantly racist foe with a segregated military. We still have high levels of segregation in our homeland. We're worried about the communists because they've got they're about the only non-black group that is interested in racial equality. You got to do something about this. We're not quite sure what, but so we're going to hire some experts to find out. If they had hired Du Bois, and they almost did, they would have gotten a sociological look at what the race problem was in the United States. But through the machinations in the background of people like Park, Gunnar Myrdal, who was a Swedish economist, got the gig. Now, he was not a bad man. American Dilemma is a very famous book. It focused attention on the race problem, but it conceptualized the race problem as a matter of hearts and minds. That white folks need to get over their racist feelings, and that you got to sort of fix the way you think. Well, that hasn't worked too well either. Arguably, it's the other way around, that the social inequality based on economic and political forces is what produces those ways of stinking thinking. So let me summarize Morris's argument again. Contrary to the way this story is usually told, he is not an isolated genius, that he really did develop the first school of scientific sociology in Atlanta, and they did a bunch of stuff. It's just mostly sitting on dusty shelves someplace. It's silenced by, one of the reasons why it's sitting on a dusty shelf unnoticed, silenced by a white supremacist conspiracy led by Park on behalf of Washington, influenced Weber, lost funding that for his own Encyclopedia of the Negro. Remember I said that was a lifelong obsession of his. Funding that then went to Gunnar Myrdal, who wrote an American Dilemma, sending scholarship and policy in a very different direction. All right, now we're going to hear briefly from Du Bois. As I got deeper and deeper into Du Bois in my teaching career, I said, he's got to be on, he lived till 1963. Wasn't he on Face the Nation or something, Meet the Press. You can spend the whole evening, I've done this a couple of times, watching Malcolm X on YouTube, right? Because he was interviewed, and there's a terrible one with the famous Len O'Connor from Chicago. So what do we call you? We call you Mr. X? It's like, God almighty. And we loved Len O'Connor when I was a kid. Anyway, so you Google, you YouTube, nothing. Not even like newsreel pictures that I could find, at least. I mean, I didn't try real hard, but I tried. And then I discovered that in 1961, when he was 93 years old, he was interviewed for Folkways Records. Now, Folkways Records was really famous for uncovering a lot of indigenous music. They'd go out and with their recording equipment out into the middle of nowhere in Alabama and record old Blind Lemon Chitlin, before and his slide guitar, that kind of stuff. But they did Du Bois, and it's about an hour. They made a phonograph record, you know, a spoken word phonograph record. And Folkways, in affiliation with the Smithsonian Institution, put it on a CD. And so you can listen to him. And I couldn't believe it, because he talks just like he writes. Except that his dentures leak. But you know, I hope that someday I'm 93 years old and my dentures leak, because his mind is very sharp. I'm going to start at the beginning, which is a very fine place to start, as he talks about his background and going to Fisk and then on to Harvard and to Germany. But then we're going to skip ahead to the surprise. You know, I only listened to parts of this when I use it in class a little bit. The students kind of fell asleep because they're not used to this kind of, where's the pictures? You know, listening to this kind of an audio thing. But damn it, I kept on, you know, using the interview. But finally one day I was sitting at home listening to the whole thing, and I got to this one part, and I said, holy shit. We'll close with a holy shit moment. Those are always good. The more of those, the better. We should have like a sign out in front of MCC, you know, the 14 days since the last Epiphany. That's the nice word for a holy shit moment.
I went from my home in Massachusetts when I was 17 down to Fisk University in Tennessee. There I stayed 3 years. Then I came from there to Harvard University in the fall of '85 and stayed there 4 years, 2 years in the college and 2 years in the graduate department. Then I went to Berlin and stayed 2 years. At Fisk, we had an institution for Negroes, taught for the most part by white people who were graduates of Oberlin and of Yale. The college was, after the New England tradition, the regular college with Latin and Greek and mathematics and history and so forth. Comparatively small classes, because in the whole college department there were only about 25. Very good teachers, and the general surroundings, except the White City, but the general surroundings inside the college were excellent.
Now we're going to skip ahead to Germany.
Now, of course, I went to Germany, and there, of course, I had a tremendous new experience. For the first time in my life, I was just a human being and not a particular kind of human being. I remember getting on the boat at Rotterdam to make the Rheinreise, the journey up the Rhine, and there was a Dutch lady and 3 daughters, 2 grown and one about 12, on the boat. So I followed out the customs I would have in America. I got in part of the boat where they were not. I mean, if they got toward the bow, I went toward the upper head. Until finally the little girl walked straight over to me and asked what language I spoke, and I told her that I spoke English and a little German. And then the mother came over, and
truck
we
going
became
by.
just a little group of travelers. We were the only ones on this small boat, and had a beautiful trip up the Rhine from Rotterdam to Cologne. It was a new experience, of course, to me, and a very inspiring one. Then I went to Eisenach in the Rhine-Pfalz and spent a summer with this family of a professor. And they had 2 daughters.
See what I'm saying about this enduring
Polish,
theme?
French and English.
Cherchez les femmes.
And we had a lovely summer. And from there, in the fall, I went to Berlin. In Berlin, I had the chance to get into a seminar, which was rather unusual for a foreigner. But I was allowed in this seminar on economics under two of the most prominent professors. And for 3 semesters I studied there. I wanted to take the examination, but the rule was that you could not come up for examination until you had been 3 semesters at the university. And I had only been 2, and I only had money for that. They tried to make an exception, but the English professor had a lot of candidates, so that no difference could be made. I brought to their attention the fact that I had already had 2 years at Harvard, but they didn't recognize Harvard as being of the same rank as Berlin. So I had to come back without my degree. On the other hand, it's rather interesting to know that last year, when I was in Berlin, that the university brought out my records and gave me the degree that I didn't get some 70 years before.
So now he's going to talk about, I thought it was funny about Harvard, he's going to talk about Atlanta University, and then we'll skip to the Epiphany.
I came back from Berlin in 1892. And then there was the question as to where and what I was going to work in the United States. There wasn't, of course, the slightest chance of my getting any position in a white university, in spite of the fact that I had had better education than most white students had had. First, I tried to see if I could get in a colored school, either a college or even a public school. One public school down in Tennessee considered me for a while, but thought I had rather too much education for them. Then I got an offer from Wilberforce. Now, I knew something about Wilberforce. Wilberforce at first was known as Tawawa Springs out in southern Ohio, where a good many Southerners used to come up for their vacations. Then it became a place where they sent their colored children for education. And finally, it was bought by the Negro Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And they established a college there. And I was offered a position there, which I accepted immediately. $800 a year. Just after I had accepted that, I got an offer from Tuskegee, Book of Washington. If I had got that offer first, I would have taken it, but I had already promised to go to Wilberforce, so that I didn't.
Isn't that ironic?
I got another offer from Missouri at $1,500 a year, but money didn't mean anything to me then. I had offered to go to Wilberforce. I didn't know anything about this Missouri institution. And still I went to Wilberforce. There I stayed 2 years, rather difficult years. The institution, of course, was a rather low grade, but with a great deal of devotion and enthusiasm. And I had ideas of turning it into a great German institution of learning. I ran against the religious difficulties, well, in other ways. For instance, I wore my cane and gloves always, because in Germany, if you didn't wear cane and gloves, you were practically naked. I've never been a person with a very great sense of religion. I was fairly orthodox, but certainly not fundamental. And so I walk with my cane and gloves into a prayer meeting and sit down at the back, and then the student who was carrying on the prayer meeting says, "We will be led in prayer by Professor Du Bois." And I said, "No, you won't." And I came near losing my job there because the bishops were outraged. Of course, everybody led in prayer there, and they had revivals. Well, that made initial difficulties, and I knew that in the end they would get rid of me because I wasn't orthodox enough. Still, I had a nice 2 years there. And I had some very good students, and we did some good work. The only difficulty was I was teaching Latin and Greek when my specialty was sociology, and they didn't have any sociology, and they didn't want me to teach it. Then I got my chance I was asked to come to the University of Pennsylvania to make a study of the Negro population of the 7th Ward of Philadelphia. The people of Philadelphia were quite certain that the bad political actions of these Negroes caused all the bad government in Philadelphia. But they knew that was true, but they wanted it proved in an academic way. Of course, I couldn't be an instructor. I couldn't be a scholar because I already had my PhD from Harvard, but they made me an assistant instructor, which meant that I didn't do any instruction, but that I did make this study, and I made it on my own plan. I didn't ask the department what to do. I laid before them a plan of study, and they accepted it. And in a year and a half work, I made this study of the Philadelphia Negro, which even today is recognized as a good sort of social study. And it's been very widely used. That was my second book. My first book was my thesis at Harvard, which became the first number of the Harvard Historical Series.
His dissertation was on the suppression of the Atlantic slave trade, and it was, it's not the last word on the subject anymore because that was 100 years ago, but contributed significantly, I think, to the, as I understand it, to the scholarship on that important subject.
Then, after I finished this study at the University of Pennsylvania, or before I finished it, the question with me was how this kind of study could be carried on and applied to the whole Negro problem in the United States, because, as I said and increasingly believed, the Negro problem was a matter of knowledge, that we were talking about it and we didn't know anything about it, that just because a man was born a Negro didn't mean that he knew what all the other millions were doing, and that what we needed was an academic study of the American Negro. And I wanted University of Pennsylvania and Harvard and Yale and so forth to go into a sort of partnership by which this kind of study could be forwarded. But they, of course, didn't do anything at all. But Atlanta University, which was a Negro institution down in Atlanta, Georgia, asked me to come down there and teach and take charge of such a study. So that in 1897, I went to Atlanta University and stayed there 13 years, making a systematic study of the American Negro, which wasn't well done because we didn't have money enough or personnel to carry it out. But nevertheless, it's fair to say that for the next 25 years, there wasn't a book published on the Negro problem that didn't have to depend upon what we were doing at Atlanta University. It was the first study of the sort. Ours was the first institution in the United States, white or black, that had any course on the history of the American Negro or on Negro history in general. So that it was a good beginning. But while I was there, my faith in knowledge as a solution of the Negro problem was shaken. Lynching was common. Before I went away from there, there was an average of one lynching every week for some years. And it was a terrible sort of thing. There was one case very near Atlanta in which I knew from my studies just what had happened. It was a case of a Negro peasant not receiving his wages at the end of the season. He got in a fight with his hirer and killed him and ran away. And then when they couldn't find him, they raised the altogether new issue that he had raped the man's wife, which was evidently just dragged in. Well, I had a letter which I hadn't delivered to Joel Chandler Harris, the author of the Uncle Remus tales. He was then on the Atlanta Constitution. So I took that letter and started downtown to deliver it to him and to talk to him about this situation. And on the way down, I found that this Negro, Sam Hose, had been caught and lynched, and that in the meat market, which was on the way I had to pass, his fingers and toes were being exhibited. Well, I didn't deliver the letter. I went back to Atlanta University. And then I made up my mind that knowledge wasn't enough. That even if people were ignorant of essential matters which they had to know, they wouldn't correct their actions without more realization of just what the difficulties were. They had not only to know, but they had to act.
So this is what the early 20th century, before even while he was still at Atlanta. He's still a relatively young man, but the turn toward activism is really occurring, and that was kind of the direction that he went in the rest of his life. The Sam Hose story is particularly gruesome, but that was typical. There was a whole market in memorabilia of lynchings, bits and pieces, souvenirs from the body of the lynched person. All right, let's go to this. I'll close with, he's talking, the track is called The Negro and Young People. So, this is 1963, so you're beginning to see the campus politics that became much more intense later in the 1960s. You're only a year before the free speech movement at Berkeley. That it's still the ban the bomb movement. They're still wearing khakis and playing guitars with the Bob Dylan harmonica frame around their neck, so they can play. We're doing Blowing in the Wind still, okay? And a few years later, it's, R-E-S-P-E-C-T, but or what's going on? Let's go, anyway. But at that moment, there was activism, especially among black college students. The sit-ins at the lunch counters were definitely going on at that time. So the interviewer was asking him about that. So let's see, that's track 4, track 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I almost forgot how to do this. 12.
Lately, I've been encouraged by the fact that the young people, the students, have resumed leadership, which I was afraid that they had given up during the McCarthy era. I spoke at several institutions. I spoke at Princeton and Chicago and I think University of Illinois, quite a number, but the students didn't respond. They seemed to me awfully dull. And I just made up my mind that this was an age where we were not going to have the inspiration of the young. And now, suddenly, without any encouragement on my part, and little encouragement on the part of others, comes this sit-down, where the students have put their finger on a very important point.
This is the part that...
The Negro problem, of course, is a problem of mob violence and of disfranchisement and of injustice in the courts and of difficulties of getting decent jobs. It's all that. But in addition to that, the Negro problem is a series of little meannesses which are really unimportant, that help nobody, and yet which all of the Negroes have to meet, and which most of them simply meet and say nothing. I mean the fact that you go downtown shopping, you can't get a sandwich or a cup of coffee. There are towns down there where you can't sit in the park. You can't go to the movies, or if you do go, you have to go to a very unpleasant place right at the top. All sorts of things of that kind which have been going on, and which in my day we simply said, well, gracious, we've got to stop people being murdered if they can't get a cup of coffee, that's a little thing. But the students put their finger on that, and they fought.
Does anybody know the term that we've come to use in just in recent years for those little meannesses? Yeah. Microaggressions. He was ahead of his time on that too. And I don't know, I haven't read anything about, so you can imagine how I felt, sitting here after listening to this and that, holy crap. And of course this also has to do with gender, disability, all kinds of people, of just the little soul-killing daily shit that people go through. He was on top of that as well. Just blows my mind. Almost makes me want to unretire so I can teach it again. So I'll just keep coming back at Black History Month to tell that story, because it was amazing. So I hope that gave you some insight into the life and work of W.E.B. Du Bois. We have time for questions, if anybody has questions or comments, and we can go on with our day. Anything? Yes? Oh, my pleasure. Mm-hmm.
Were so fearful in anger that they had inside that I couldn't quite, I couldn't understand.
Yeah.
While I experienced different incidents in my life, I couldn't understand why someone concern or fear
Mm-hmm.
existed. So, hearing these stories and saying that they certainly may have witnessed or known others or saw it on TV, things that were done.
Mm-hmm.
Happening around them is really a long way.
And Du Bois was right in the middle of all that and trying to make sense of it, and trying to, and that made him a pretty unique figure, I think. For those who want to get into Du Bois, he's not real easy to read because, I said he talks the way he writes. He also writes the way he talks, in that kind of Victorian, flowery, mid-19th century English style. One of the many ironies of his life was that he became a real Germanophile, I guess that's the word for it. He loved Germany. He loved Wagner, and I'm thinking, oh no. Because, I use Woody Allen's line about Wagner. I don't listen to Wagner anymore because every time I hear it, it makes me want to invade Poland. And that's kind of, Mike Hillstrom and I team taught a course in music and sociology, and we don't see eye to eye on on Wagner, let's put it that way. But, they say it's not his fault, the use to which his music was made, but I think, yes, it was. So that's, he loved the opera, he loved Germany, and it just broke his heart when things went horribly wrong in Germany in the middle of the 20th century. He was also kind of rooting for the Japanese a little bit. He's writing in 1920, the Japanese were the only third world power to win a war at least at that time, the Russo-Japanese War. The Japanese cleaned the Russians' clock in 1906. And he was kind of rooting for the non-whites, and he says, some people think that the Japanese want to make war against the United States. Well, they kind of did later. They changed their mind. So, when you live that long, things change around you. But having said all of that, he's hard to read. Souls of Black Folk is the best place to start. You don't have to read all the chapters. They're not very long. There's a whole long chapter about an African-American religious leader named Alexander Crummell. I have not read that chapter, and I've read that book dozens of times. Just skip around and read those different sections. But another book, and this is one of the ones that I discovered later, 1920, 17 years later, 17 years of getting kind of tired of dealing with white people, a little bit more edge to it. The book's called Dark Water, and it's also brief. It's collected things, some things he wrote for magazines and stuff. It isn't a through composed kind of a book, but he's got a short story about a comet that passes. New York passes through the tail of a comet, and everybody dies except a black man and a white woman, and how that turns out. He has another short story, Jesus in Texas. But he also has an essay called The Souls of White Folk. And he says, he's speaking as a black man to white folk, we know you. You can't put anything over on us. We've been watching. He also complains about how white immigrants come into America, and one of the ways they establish their legitimacy as real Americans is to become white supremacists, to develop racial attitude. They get off the boat, he says, programmed to hate black folks. Again, 1920, and that's the essay, that's the book in which the essay, The Damnation of Women, is included. And especially if you're interested in women's rights and women's issues, which, like I say, black history is American history, women's issues are everybody's issues, but that essay is contained in Dark Water. Those would be the two main places to start. The other books they're pretty big. The Black Reconstruction, I read it in the Northwoods, but I'm not a normal person. I read stuff like that up north because that's where I remember stuff better. So, but that, if you want to follow up on Du Bois, that's how to do it. And there's as far as I know, no other electronic media artifact of Du Bois. But if anybody finds one, I would sure like to know. So, pass that word on. Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
I just got a comment. I really do appreciate this. My mother made my brother and I read, we pretended to read The Souls of Black Folks as kids, in
Yeah.
my understanding this. When I was studying sociology some in college, I didn't necessarily want to read that.
Uh-huh.
But I loved before the house where she had some old Crisis magazines with his picture in it and some of his work, and I used to like reading Crisis magazine and remember it from
Yeah.
when he was the publisher of Crisis. So maybe I'll take a stab.
There you go. Well, that was one of the things that came out in the biography that I wasn't aware of, that in a lot of black homes they'd have the Bible and they'd have the Souls of Black Folk. Those would be, if there were two books in the house, that's what the two books would be. And many people of very modest means would subscribe to the Crisis and read everything that he had to say. He was very influential in the black community that way. And even if people didn't agree with him, or maybe sometimes not even understand what he was arguing about, that was a touchstone, almost like a sacred object, almost, in a lot of African American homes. So yeah, that would be good. You're already halfway there because you've been softened up. Sometimes when you read something the second time, it's easier than the first. Any other questions or comments? Well, thank you all for coming. Enjoy the rest of Black History Month.